Hello, Glacier Hills. This is Paul Arnold. I serve as the Spiritual Care and Missions Manager here at Glacier Hills. It's a fancy title for a chaplain. And as a chaplain, I've received years of training so that I can listen to people and counsel them and identify emotions that they're going through. And the most common emotion that I've heard is anxiety. No wonder we're still in a pandemic, a national election is coming up, and then the social unrest in our country around injustice is everywhere you look. And so it's a time where anxiety is a very common emotion. And so I have found some videos that will help identify some strategies and define what anxiety is about and ways that we can cope. And I'll share some techniques that I have found to be helpful for me as well. So first you'll see a video from a licensed counselor, then a psychologist, and then I found a webinar or an online seminar from Dr. Whitehead, who's a researcher up in University of Michigan Dearborn. So I hope they enjoy this video, and I'm glad you joined us.
Anxiety and depression is incredibly common in seniors, but it's not really a health concern that we associate with them very much. In fact, anxiety is twice as likely to be a diagnosis in seniors than dementia. But a lot of times these symptoms are similar. People are kind of foggy-headed. They may have memory issues. They may have trouble carrying on a conversation. They may be tired or listless. But more often, these are symptoms of anxiety and depression. The good news is that it's highly treatable, sometimes with a form of medication, but also with therapy, talk therapy usually once a week. The issue is, though, with this generation, they're a very strong-willed generation, and oftentimes therapy is kind of a bad word to them, that it's associated with being crazy. And the challenge for the family and for the therapist is to assure them that this is a common issue that many people deal with and that they're not crazy, just something is out of balance, and we're going to help them feel better again.
Hello there, my name is Dr. Jim Collins. This week, my topic is on aging and anxiety. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, around 40 million Americans suffer anxiety disorders at one point in their lives. Although many anxiety disorders begin during the adolescent and teen years, it is now widely accepted that anxiety disorders are highly prevalent among older adults in the United States. As a matter of fact, older women experience anxiety more than older men do. Now, this is interesting. Anxiety is twice as prevalent in the elderly population, which makes it the single most common mental health problem among seniors. I would have assumed it was depression. Can anxiety be missed by physicians, family, and friends? Unfortunately, the answer to this question is yes. Physicians who see and treat older patients might miss the signs and symptoms of anxiety and simply brush them off as normal aging, or perhaps another disorder. If anxiety is not being diagnosed, it's not being treated. And that can really affect quality of life. Family and friends can also miss signs and symptoms and consider it just natural and normal. Normal part of aging. Still worse, there are individuals who think that older seniors with anxiety can just snap out of it. Stop your excessive worrying. Don't be afraid. Don't be nervous. It's that simple. Well, it's not that simple. They also miss the accompanying physical problems that anxiety can worsen, like chest pain, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, or sweating without any physical exertion. That's kind of short and sweet, but I do have a lengthier article. If you'd like to read it, please follow the link below to Aging and Anxiety. And if you'd like to take some CEUs on this topic and many others like it, follow the link to CEU Academy. Until next time, my name's Dr. Jim Collins. Be well.
We can now move into the meat of tonight's talk, which is the individual stress and coping experience. So when I began conducting my own study, exploring the psychological experiences of older adults early on in the pandemic, the conversation in the media was almost entirely dominated by concerns for physical health, and for understandable reasons, right? We didn't want to get the virus. We didn't want to spread the virus. But very little was being said in those first few weeks about the psychological implications of all of this. The thinking seemed to be, we'll take care of physical health for now, and we can deal with mental health once the physical risk had passed. Well, first, unfortunately, the risk hasn't just passed. And second, even if it had been relatively short-lived, we simply cannot separate physical health from mental health. They are not two separate pillars of existence that never touch. No, they are intricately intertwined vines that cannot help but influence one another as we move through life. Now, I won't go into all of the research highlighting this, but in light of the present context, I will mention research on immune function. So our immune system is incredibly influenced by our mental health status. Experimental studies have actually given people cuts and then manipulated their stress levels, and the cuts healed slower for those experiencing more distress. Our stress, depression, and anxiety influences our physical health and functioning, and our physical health influences our ability to effectively manage things psychologically. We cannot talk about one without the other. Mental health has to be part of the conversation when it comes to COVID-19. So let's talk about a key aspect of mental health, stress. A word for our times, is it not? According to the stress and coping framework, which I actually previously mentioned in passing, but I'm going to talk a little bit more deeply through right now, we approach our stress via two intermediate mechanisms, okay? So we start off with the appraisal mechanism, in which the person considers the stressor and its stressfulness. And then there is a second mechanism, a coping mechanism, in which the person engages his or her coping resources to combat the stress. Now, it's really important to note that coping is not engaged unless in the appraisal step, the stressor is actually determined to be stressful. Now, if we appraise a given event as stressful, we experience heightened levels of arousal. So psychologically, we might feel really hot, get that pit of the stomach feeling, get sweaty palms, feel our breathing and heart rate increase, feel a lot of muscle tension. You know this, right? You've felt this. Psychologically, we experience all of those what if thoughts, those feelings of overwhelm and persistent rumination, where constant intrusive thoughts about the stressor and everything that goes with it float around in our brains, often disrupting our focus, our sleep, and our functioning. So in the short term, this arousal represents our biological fight or flight response, where we are readying ourselves for battle with the source of our stress. This arousal prompts action taking as we recruit our coping resources in an effort to win the war, right? If our coping behaviors are effective in eliminating the stressor, or at least in reducing our arousal, then we are unlikely to experience any long-term effects from the stressor. We go back to homeostasis. But if our coping efforts are not effective or not quite enough, and that physiological and psychological arousal becomes chronic, that is when we start to see downstream health problems that wear and tear on the body. We might see hypertension, immune dysregulation, as well as clinical levels of depression and anxiety symptoms. So clearly, chronically high stress is not good. And this is true across the lifespan, but becomes particularly important for those in later life who are more likely to be dealing with those age-linked health challenges, often exacerbated by stress and its effects. So let's talk a bit more about the stressor experience. All right, what makes something feel stressful? I'm going to discuss 5 dimensions of stressfulness: onset, duration, controllability, clustering, and physical threat. As I talk about these, I'm going to also be incorporating some of the findings from my own surveys of older adults' experience during those early weeks of COVID-19. So this first dimension, onset. More sudden, unexpected stressors are more distressing. COVID, particularly the shutdown measures, were quite sudden and unexpected for most people. People were scrambling to stock up on everything from flour and bleach to toilet paper. Why? And routines were completely halted as schools, workplaces, community centers, and religious institutions shut down. When I asked adults 60 and over across the United States what they were finding most stressful or challenging during those early weeks of the pandemic, the sudden, unexpected nature of COVID-19 was captured in multiple response categories. So one of these is in the sudden imposed restrictions. So people listed things like having to cancel trips, cancel plans, the lack of freedom to do what I want to do. People talked about adjusting to change. So having to establish a whole new routine just out of nowhere. And of course, learning the technology to work from home. I know I can relate to that one. There were also responses that identified others hoarding as a key source of stress. So we have quotes like people hoarding paper products and finding items that are not available in stores. COVID caused a sudden rearrangement of normal, and that is incredibly stressful. The next dimension I'm going to talk about here is duration. So more chronic, unknown endpoint stressors are more distressing. And we, unfortunately, don't really know how long this new normal will last. I think most people would admit that it's going to be longer than we ever anticipated it being back in March. Now, this domain of stressfulness was also captured in my surveys. So I had many responses that fit into what I ended up calling the unknown future category. So nearly 10% of participants reported the most stressful or challenging aspect of all of this was the unknown, not knowing when it will be over, wondering when things will be back to normal. Not knowing how long something will last is incredibly distressing. And this unknown future concern actually also ties into the next dimension of stressfulness, which is controllability. So stressors that are outside of our control are more distressing. Although we can do small things to flatten the curve or slow the spread, things like stay home, wear masks, wash our hands, COVID itself is outside of our own personal control. And when I looked at the responses in my surveys, there were several categories that came out that fit into this overarching theme. So one of those had to do with the government. So we had responses related to federal leadership. Clearly, the government is outside of our control, at least when we're not in the voting booth, right? We had responses related to the news. Again, we can't control the news. This was back very early on when there was a lot of bad news coming from New York and Italy. A particular piece of our news experience that exacerbates this effect is this 24-hour news cycle, right? We're constantly barraged with headlines, and because they sell and people read them, often the headlines are negative, and we're constantly getting these hits of stressful information. And sometimes the best approach is just to stop, right? I know I have to do that for myself. It's so difficult when we can't control the news. We also aren't in control of the economy. So there were a number of responses related to concerns over personal finances, such as family business or retirement, as well as overall economy concerns. And of course, we can't control the behavior of others. So there were many responses related to other people's behavior, such as seeing people disregarding social distancing or people not taking COVID-19 seriously. Being in control makes us feel like we can fix it, we can do this. When we're not in control, we have to be more creative about how we cope. And I'll talk more about this in a moment when we get to coping. The fourth dimension of stressfulness I'm going to talk about tonight is clustering. So stressors that impact multiple domains of life are more distressing. COVID has impacted nearly everything: social activities, family gatherings, school, work, shopping, healthcare access, financial stability, religious practices, haircuts, the list goes on. This reality is represented in the diversity of responses to my most stressful survey question. So I know it may be hard to see all of the categories in this graph, but the fact that so many themes emerged really identifies the many domains of life that COVID touched for the sample of older adults in my study. And it's really important to recognize that although many of these categories are applicable to anyone, regardless of age, there are some age-linked considerations that might magnify some of the stress effect of this clustering for those experiencing some age-linked vulnerabilities. So one of these has to do with social isolation. So older adults, particularly those over age 80, are more likely to have lost a spouse and live alone. So even without COVID, these people are more at risk for social isolation. Add in the mandated physical distancing and the added fear about being around others, and this isolation and its impact on mental health is magnified. In my study, being married was the only demographic factor that emerged as protective against stress reactivity, which is a testament to the value of having at least one other person physically with you during a pandemic lockdown. Another age-linked consideration to be aware of is mobility. So with age comes a greater likelihood for transportation and mobility limitations. And this makes things like shopping particularly challenging for those facing these constraints. We add in the additional shopping-related risk of COVID, along with the empty shelves, and there were ration limits on things like milk, bread, and eggs. And it's no wonder that responses related to shopping earned the 5th most frequent spot in my study. So this represents a very practical way, actually, for neighbors or family members to help. We may not be able to physically be with somebody or take them somewhere, but I know some people who have just ordered a shipped order for an older adult who is not physically able to get out and get groceries. So this is something very practical that we can do if there is somebody we know, regardless of age, who is experiencing this COVID exacerbated isolation. We also might see more vulnerable financially. So we're generally aware that there might be some on fixed incomes, relying on Social Security. There is a segment of those in later life that face financial strain or insecurity in non-pandemic times. The almost immediate impact of COVID-19 and the resulting shutdowns on the stock market and the overall economy was felt incredibly strongly by older adults, particularly those relying on investments for retirement income. There were a number of responses, as I mentioned previously, related to this financial stability piece when it comes to what is most stressful and challenging. Now, I know the stock market has recovered quite a bit since those early days, but we don't really know what's around the corner. Things are volatile, and with economic volatility comes added stress. We also might see an additional age-linked stress magnifier in the context of cognitive concerns. So Although not everyone experiences cognitive challenges as they age, biological aging does represent a higher risk for dementia and problems with memory and focus. So concern about cognitive symptoms is a major late life stressor in non-pandemic times, but over 5% of participants reported more problems focusing and getting things done as a result of the stress they were experiencing due to COVID. So, and those who reported that in my study had significantly higher stress levels than those who reported other primary stressors. So our minds represent our being, and trouble with our minds is extremely distressing. When it comes to this clustering, clearly older adults experiencing challenges in more than one of these domains pre-pandemic are particularly vulnerable to the cumulative stress that can come with COVID. So really important to be aware of these features if there is a particular person that is feeling distressed in this way. There's also the dimension of physical threat when it comes to what is stressful. So stressors that pose a true risk for our physical well-being immediately rise to the top in stressfulness. So unlike the vast majority of stressors in our current day and age, like 30-year mortgages or being late to work, COVID does represent a very real risk to the physical well-being of ourselves and our loved ones. And we already talked about the added age-linked biological risk faced by older adults. So when it came to those most stressful responses in my survey, responses from participants reflected this in this second most frequent category, this concern for others category. Statements like, I'm worried about the health and safety of my son and his family, or I'm worried about doctors getting sick. There was also a virus category, which was actually much further down the list, about 10th, but still identified concern about getting the virus oneself. So worrying about contracting COVID, or worried about what happens to my dogs if I get sick. So basically, COVID checks every box for stressfulness. Once again, however, the heterogeneity of experience of people 60 and older are clear. Everyone was experiencing the same pandemic, but different people who had different backgrounds and contexts and previous experiences and resources found different aspects most stressful. Now, it's important to realize that in circumstances like the times we're in, stress is a perfectly normal and potentially even adaptive response. It can engage us to reevaluate priorities, cultivate and strengthen resources, and get in tune with our mental health. But if the distress levels become too high for too long, that's when we encounter those problems. And that's why we need to talk about the importance of coping. So how do we cope when we're feeling this distress? When it comes to coping, how we cope depends in part on the degree of control we have over the situation. Now, I already mentioned how control makes something feel more stressful, or lack of control, I should say, makes something feel more stressful. A lack of control also limits what we can do to effectively deal with the stressor. So there are two primary ways of dealing with stress: problem-focused coping, which targets the stressor itself, and emotion-focused coping, which targets our own emotional response and perception of the stressor. When we have some control over the situation, problem-focused coping is generally best. So our finances are too tight, so we find another source of income, or we adjust our spending. Our roof is leaking, so we fix it, or we pay somebody else to fix it. Our back is killing us, so we go to the doctor or go to physical therapy. Ideally, problem-focused coping completely eliminates the stressor and the stress. When we don't have control over the situation, problem-focused coping behaviors are not only ineffective, but they can even make things worse. Trying to control something you can't is an exercise in frustration. Just ask anyone with kids, right? So when we have very little control, the most effective approach in managing our distress is emotion-focused coping. This might be seeking support from a friend or family member, going for a walk, saying a prayer, petting a dog, or just putting on a laugh out loud sitcom. Anything that helps us change our perspective or improve our positive feelings can be effective in reducing our distress and improving our mental health, as long as it doesn't involve unhelpful behaviors like substance abuse or complete denial of the situation. So in situations where we have some control, then utilizing both forms of coping is usually the most effective approach. So we have yes, no, and some. And again, problem-focused coping, if we can do it, always best. But in situations like COVID, emotion-focused coping is likely where we need to turn. So in my survey of older adults, participants reported many different emotion-focused coping behaviors that brought them comfort or joy during the early weeks of the pandemic. And once again, this chart is a testament to the heterogeneity of experience. So again, I know you might not be able to see all of these, but I am going to highlight some of the key clusters of responses that came out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about social connection as coping, faith, distraction, self-care, helping, and gratitude. So first, talking about the social connection piece. So social support is always one of the most reported coping approaches. But in the environment of isolation created by COVID, this social support became particularly impactful. So we see quotes talking about FaceTime with grandchildren, being home with husband and dogs. And in the context of COVID, these digital interaction sorts of responses, talking about video chats and social media, they emerged as one of the most common sources of comfort and joy in this particular time. So we learned that in-person support is ideal, yes, but this digital interaction can also be incredibly supportive. We also had many people identifying faith or religious coping as a key way of seeking joy and comfort during the challenging time. So especially for the current generation of older adults, religious coping is a theme that emerges over and over when older adults talk about how they cope with stress. And research demonstrates the effectiveness of faith in reducing stress levels. So people identified prayer, meditation, music, faith in God, being able to watch my church service online, which again is another testament to the blessing of technology in the current time. There were also many people identifying sources of distraction that help them cope. So people identifying quarantine humor or painting, reading, cooking. It might seem like distraction would not be a recommended approach, but research actually shows that in cases of little or no control, coping by distraction is actually an adaptive response. So as long as the distraction isn't something destructive, right? As I mentioned already. So go ahead and binge that show on Netflix or bake 16 different types of bread. Just make sure that this form of coping is complemented by some of the others, most especially the self-care. So self-care can take a number of different, it can look a number of different ways, but the most common response that fell into this category had to do with getting exercise. Many people reported going for a walk as their primary way of finding comfort or joy. And this is a way to get outside, right? To get out of the house, clear the head, get some nature. All of these things are research-supported ways of reducing stress. And physical activity, as we know, also has health and cognitive benefits. We then also have helping as coping. So we may not be able to control the stressor, but we can control the ways in which we help others. For example, many parents suddenly found themselves without childcare. So many grandparents stepped in to help with care and homeschooling. Participants also reported making masks, helping with food drives. We all have something that we can share, and research reveals helping to be a powerful way to cope with stress. We just may need to be a little creative in the times of social distancing. I'm finally going to talk about gratitude. So gratitude has been a hot topic over the past decade, and for good reason. Getting grateful has huge benefits for stress reduction and mental health. People in my study identified or shared things like getting joy from singing birds, the sunshine, my warm, comfortable home, that my family is healthy. Just taking the time to find one small positive thing amidst the COVID life can go a long way to rewiring our brains to focus on the positive instead of dwelling on the negatives that we just can't do anything about. So seek out the good news, or as Mr. Rogers famously said, look for the helpers. Now, all of these are research-supported ways of coping. And it's really important, though, that exactly how a given individual will choose to cope is different. There's this heterogeneity present again. So finding a combination of strategies that works for you, your loved one, or your client is really key. So what comes next? We've talked about the stress, the appraisal, the coping. Ideally, the coping is effective and you go back to homeostasis, right? But if stress levels are not effectively managed, if our coping efforts are not enough, that's when we can get to these mental health diagnoses, most commonly anxiety or depression. Although there is not a lot of published research yet on COVID and mental health in later life, there is already some evidence that older adults are experiencing higher levels of COVID-related depression and anxiety than younger folks are. And associations between these mental health conditions and factors like immune function, cardiovascular risk, and suicide risk really highlight the importance of stress management and mental health treatment during a pandemic. So what does mental health treatment look like in a COVID world? One word, telehealth, right? The vast majority of practitioners have transitioned their in-person sessions to virtual format. And this reality removes a lot of the barriers present for traditional care. But for those with limited internet access or sensory difficulties that make engaging with screens problematic, or who are just uncomfortable with technology, this telehealth reality can actually be a barrier. So reaching out to those who we may see as vulnerable to overwhelming distress, who may not be comfortable with telehealth options, they may benefit from some support, some encouragement, some training, getting them comfortable with that so that they can engage in this really important mental health treatment or therapy if it is needed. Now, I want to finish on a positive note. Although stress can result in these mental health challenges, it can also lead to positive change and growth in the form of resilience. So let's chat a little bit about that as we finish up here. Resilience is basically the ability to maintain positive well-being in the face of life's challenges, to ride the waves and not sink, to bounce back, to stretch and not snap. Is that enough metaphors? Although some people seem to be wired to be more resilient, there is a lot of evidence that resilience is built by experience. So this idea is that every time we have to deal with a challenge or a stressor, we build skills and resources, making us more resilient the next time something threatens to sink us. Although chronological age is not a guarantee of resilience, having lived more life does make it more likely that we have faced a buttload of stressors and built up this toolbox of skills and resources that help us deal more effectively with our stress. And this is one of the reasons that many studies find older adults to actually be less stressed or less reactive to stress than younger folks are. So what are some of the lessons that are gained through a lifetime of stressors and building resilience? The last thing I did in my survey was ask if you could share one piece of wisdom regarding the current situation, what would it be? Now, although I haven't had a chance to formally analyze this data yet, I wanted to share a few gems tonight. This too shall pass, and the best is yet to come. Have faith in the future, learn from the past, and live the present with love and determination. Take it slow and treat yourself with kindness. Worry does not help anything. Action does. Have several hobbies or activities that interest you. to help keep busy and occupied with something other than the virus. Help as you can. Be grateful for the simple things in life every day, such as family, friends, sunshine, food, shelter, and toilet paper. Meditate, pray, do whatever brings you peace on a daily basis. And finally, we need to support one another and come together to fight the real enemy, this virus. Isn't it funny how these align so well with the research-based coping practices that we just talked about? There is a lot of value in a lifetime of experience. So the takeaways here to wrap up. First, remember, COVID is not an age thing. Yes, there are age-linked biological risks when it comes to symptom severity and mortality risk, but this pandemic is impacting nearly every aspect of life for all of us, regardless of age. If we're going to get through this, all parties have to stop the us versus them generation wars and work together. Second, there is no one COVID-19 stress experience. There are many aspects of COVID-19 that different older adults may find stressful, and it's really important to remember that heterogeneity of experience. Similarly, there is no one way to cope with COVID-related distress. There are many strategies and resources that people may use that are cultivated across a lifetime of navigating challenges. Although I'm sure that many of us are discovering new ways of coping, building new resources as we encounter this situation that we've never had to experience before. And we also have to remember that, yes, stress is bad, but stress can also build resilience. As a stressor, COVID is really unmatched in its resilience building capacity. And as we struggle through this incredibly challenging time, let's not waste this opportunity for growth as we grow both individually and hopefully as a society. And finally, it is normal to feel stressed by COVID-19, no matter how old you are. But overwhelming stress for an extended period of time is a burden that no one should have to carry. So mental health awareness and treatment is so important, even if it has to be engaged in via a telehealth option. So please don't hesitate to seek help. And that is all that I have tonight. Thank you so much for your attention.
I hope you found those videos informative and helpful as you consider how you're coping with all the anxiety that we see in this world today and experience in ourselves. About 10 years ago, a friend shared with me a book called The 10 Best, excuse me, I'll do it all over again. Maybe I'll button this and try again here, all right? All right. 3, 2, 1. Hello, this is Paul Arnold, the chaplain here at Glacier Hills, and I hope that you enjoyed watching those videos that were informative and help you understand a little bit about anxiety and ways we can work with it in our lives. About 10 years ago, a friend shared with me a book called The 10 Best Anxiety Management Techniques, and it's written by Margaret Werenberg. And at first I was like, oh, that sounds too gimmicky, 10 best ways. But I did find this very helpful, and I want to share some of her points with you before we end this video. The first one is very obvious: manage your body, meaning you need to eat well, sleep well, and get regular exercise. Those are the 3 best ways you can stay physically and emotionally healthy. Second is obvious too, but it's breathing well, using meditation, yoga, or prayer to slow down your breathing to help you relax your muscles and have less tension. It sounds easy, but it does take practice. And then the third one is mindful awareness. It means simply saying, hey, wait a second, how am I doing right now? Am I aware of how anxious I really am, or things are happening in my body? It might be pain in your back, some people hold tension there, or flutters in your stomach, or catastrophic thinking like, oh, this is horrible, it's only going to get worse. Anxiety can be a pattern of living, and Wierenberg writes that when worry calls your name, don't answer the call. I would say, worry, don't go down that road. Sometimes if you start worrying about things too much, it's only going to be a very frustrating time for you. Pick another road. Be more hopeful. The fifth thing I want to share with you is that knowing anger but not showing anger, they're two different things. We all need to know that anger exists within us because we all want control. We all want our way. And so anxiety and anger are two emotions on the same coin, or two sides of one coin. And so when you're anxious, you may ask yourself, what am I angry about? The sixth advice she gives is have a little fun. We all know that laughter is the best medicine. It's a good way to relax. It's a little harder to do on your own when you're isolated during the pandemic, but find some ways to laugh. Number 7 is simply saying to your anxiety, I'm not going to do this anymore today. It's like regaining control of your life. And then the last one is very practical and it takes some imagery, but this one has helped me the most. If I have something I'm worrying about and I just constantly worrying about it, I was told, sit down, either write it all down or analyze this worry as much as you can. Look at it from every angle. And then after you've analyzed it as much as you can, then visualize putting it in a container or a coffee can, sealing the container, and visualize putting it up on a shelf and saying, I know what that's about and I'll get to it if I need to, but for right now I choose not to worry about it, and I can go back to it anytime I want. Because there's a certain point sometimes that more worrying doesn't change anything. Other people actually use a literal box and they actually write down their worries as much as they want and they fold it up and put it in the box and put it on the shelf. My wife heard this one time. She says, well, I have worries. I'd like to put them on a cloud and blow them away. I wish things were that easily settled. But we all deal with anxiety, and I pray that this video series has helped you.